Good day, everyone. Welcome to this IEEE Standards Association webinar. We are here to speak about a very important subject, developing a workforce to support the evolving grid. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping items. Please be aware that upon entering this webinar, all attendee lines are automatically muted. Today's presentation is a one-way broadcast. If you're experiencing any technical issues, audio or visual, use the chat feature and message the host for any help with troubleshooting. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. There is a Q&A feature. Please utilize that to ask your questions. And we will have a collective Q&A session at the end. All the presentations from today's webinar is available for download. If you look at the resource button, you should be able to download them at your leisure. Please also bear in mind there's additional resources that's web URLs that may be of use to you as well. So with that, I'd like to start today's webinar. To kick things off, here's a quick poll question. I'd like to give all of you all 10, 20 seconds. If you could check the entity that you represent, or at least closely represent. Once we have your tabulations in, we will look at the results. We just want to have an idea on who are the stakeholders here present for today's webinar. Okay, hope everyone had a chance. Let's look at it. Oops. Looks like we have a large number of utility participants. We have a couple of engineering consulting. Looks like they beat out the utility folks. Lots of academia, which is great. Obviously, the topic is about education and credentialing. And then a good mix of every other stakeholder. So looks like we have pretty good representation. I want to start things off about IEEE 1547. That is one of the critical standards for today's webinar that's going to be discussed. 1547 was actually adopted into the 2005 Energy Policy Act. I have included a little excerpt from that act. The lettering in red highlights, that every electric utility shall make available upon request interconnection service to any electric consumer, where the utility serves. And it also goes on to say that this interconnection services shall be offered based on the IEEE 1547 standard that was existing at that time or amended from time to time, which is now the 2018 version, which is the current version. Just so that you're aware, there is also a new revision that's happening as we speak. Fast forward to 2020, IEEE 1547 was also adopted by the NARUC resolution, where the resolution states that states should convene proceedings to engage stakeholders to utilize existing research and experience and make evidence-based decisions to adopt the current 1547 standard. With that, here's the next question. We would like to get the audience response. Has your state, country, or jurisdiction adopted the IEEE 1547 standard? If you could respond to this, I'll give you guys 15 seconds. All right, let's look at the results. Wow, that's a good number of jurisdictions that have already adopted. Some know, some partially, some still in progress. So that's a good sign. Thanks for that response. So today we are here to talk about workforce. I just wanted to set this up for the next speaker. The power sector workforce, through lots of research by different organizations, have sort of outlined that it may require to double, triple under the accelerated decarbonization goals that are being touted by many governments and state agencies. So you can sort of see, to keep things at baseline and then going to decarbonize, we are looking at large numbers of workforce that needs to be trained. So how do we address this situation? We are here to sort of learn that through this webinar. I have two excellent speakers with me here today who are going to be covering certain aspects. I'm going to hand this over to our next speaker, Bethany Jones. Please, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. And sorry that I cannot be on video today. We have a little technical glitches. I'm Bethany Jones, Senior Advisor for Workforce in the Department of Energy Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. So I'm going to provide a brief overview to some of our activities and how we're thinking about workforce development. I'm also just going to run through some of the large provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure law that signal new investments that will also have a connection to how we need to upskill and train the workforce to decarbonize the energy system. And then I'll just end with a few slides on a clean energy workforce framework that guides our activities in this space. So first of all, where DOE is really focusing its attention in the workforce space right now is on both job quality and job access. So we're recognizing that workforce development efforts actually need to spend more time improving work itself, not only the education and training. So we're really looking at how do we make sure that our investments align with good quality jobs and send the signal to the labor market that these jobs in the clean energy arena are good paying, will support a skilled workforce, and in order to attract and retain the skilled workers that we're going to require. We're also recognizing that there are persistent issues with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so we're putting more attention and investment into improving job access and making sure that the work opportunities are accessible to all communities across the country. And then the second high-level principle is that DOE is really leaning into its role as a convener, an entity that can bring together industry, labor, workforce partners, and identify the solution, the challenges that everyone is facing, and common solutions, so that the workforce development system isn't solely responding to models of supposed job growth, but that there's really connections between employers and workers and training providers. And we're also, recognizing the technical expertise of the department and trying to leverage that in partnership with other federal agencies that have more of the expertise on the workforce development side, like Department of Labor and Department of Energy. And so trying to bring all of the expertise across the federal government together to support really strategic workforce activities. So what do those activities entail? We're really looking at how do we calibrate training activities to real measurable labor market demand. That might involve expanding broad occupational training, getting more people into electrical apprenticeships or other trades-related work. And it might also involve upskilling incumbent workers. And I think the IEEE standard 1547 is really looking at that. How do you recognize the skills and education required for the deep adoption of some of these new technologies, and make sure that you're providing training opportunities for workers that are already in some of these occupations. The other thing we're really trying to do more of is develop national training standards, so that there's not a million different programs with a million different curricula, and it's a confusing market for potential workers or employees, but that there's a single and coherent national training standard developed for these different industries that we're trying to hold up and support, such as battery manufacturing, hydrogen, et cetera. And that those national training standards then lead to industry recognized credentials, so that utilities or manufacturers or employees all recognize the value of those training standards, and that a credential or certification means something in the industry, and that there's a clear signal to both workers and employers about what those credentials should be. We're also trying to foster more partnerships. So I would say fewer individual DOE-sponsored programs and more partnerships, bringing together industry, labor, training providers to really shift the market. And like I said above, we're really paying more attention to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, which includes both diversifying and expanding the pipeline of workers into some of the job paths that will be created from infrastructure investments, and also increasing partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions. So those are some of the things that we're really focused on in our workforce thinking and strategy at DOE. The bipartisan infrastructure law gives us a huge opportunity to invest in some of the technologies that haven't quite reached prime time yet. And so I'm going to walk through several of the large and exciting provisions. DOE is really providing seed money to get some of these new technologies sort of over the hump so that they're commercially viable in the private market. So I'll run through some of the categories of some of the bipartisan infrastructure law provisions, all of which have workforce development needs. But first, the specific workforce provisions or criteria in the bipartisan infrastructure law involve Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements for all federally funded construction activity. There's dedicated provisions for workforce development in energy efficient building operations and audits and related industry certifications. There's also, the bill also establishes the Energy Jobs Council, which supports the USEER report, which is an annual report on energy jobs based on surveys and analysis. There's also a 21st Century Energy Workforce Advisory Board that is being stood up to help DOE with its own workforce strategy and how to work with other agencies and best support the workforce needs for the future of the energy industry and energy system. And then we're being directed by the administration to look at additional labor standards. So this gets at how do we improve the work or the job quality associated with these infrastructure investments. And that involves identifying the appropriate skill standards or responsible employer criteria, project labor agreements as appropriate across industries. So again, the IEEE standard 1547 is one of those skill standards that's necessary on the grid side. We're trying to identify what those are across a lot of different technologies. So there's $7 billion to support the development of a domestic supply chain for batteries, $8 billion for clean hydrogen production and hubs, $1.5 billion for clean hydrogen manufacturing and recycling, more than $10 billion for carbon capture, direct air capture, and industrial emission reduction, $2.5 billion for advanced nuclear. And these are all things that are a little different from the Recovery Act era, where there was much more investment in wind and solar and distributed energy resources. These are more industrial solutions that we're really trying to jumpstart, recognizing that we can't fully decarbonize the grid or anything else without some more investment and use of these technologies. And then there's the stuff that we have seen in the past, the more additional funding for weatherization assistance and school retrofits and energy efficiency. There's also money for grid resilience and expansion of grid transmission infrastructure, and then there's funding for existing energy facilities and like nuclear and hydro facilities to keep those online and going. So the big work opportunities or job opportunities from these infrastructure investments are mainly in construction and related trades work. So many of the jobs required to decarbonize our grid and our energy system will be in infrastructure. Infrastructure jobs account for 11% of all jobs in the United States. And from a job quality perspective, we're really interested in these infrastructure jobs because they offer more equitable wages, particularly to workers at lower ends of the income scale. Over 80% of these jobs require on-the-job training rather than a four-year or professional degree. So there's really an opportunity for workers who have gone the on-the-job or trade school pathway to access some of these opportunities. And so we're really focusing there to make sure that the jobs that are created are good jobs and that they're accessible to people underrepresented in the industry or facing barriers to employment, such as formerly incarcerated workers or English as a second language learners, et cetera. So DOE is in this transition period where we're shifting from being primarily a research and development agency to, with the infrastructure law, really shifting a lot of our focus to deployment. And that doesn't mean we're letting go of the R&D. It's just that we're almost building a second agency that's focused on implementation and deployment. And so that also kind of shifts our thinking around workforce, where traditionally we've looked at things like collegiate competitions and how to work with scientists and engineers and engage people in very specific technologies. Now we're really looking at, well, what are the jobs required on the deployment side, and what are the skill upgrades that are going to be required to deploy this technology effectively? And so that shifts us away from just looking at the four-year advanced degree or jobs that require professional licenses to looking at how do we improve the workforce development system for construction, installation, repairs, operations, maintenance, and manufacturing. And then at the further end of the scale is the diffusion, so recognizing also that sales and program administration and finance and marketing are and real estate and other service occupations are also really important to the diffusion of emerging technology and important for the decarbonization efforts. Where we're thinking about workforce development is really at the center of these three goals. The climate goal: how do we accelerate the deployment of technologies to decarbonize buildings, transportation, energy, and industry? How do we, on the job side, how do we ensure that clean energy investments will create millions of family-sustaining jobs? And the equity goal: how do we foster inclusive economic opportunities and ensure the participation of underrepresented workers? And workforce development really lies squarely in the center, or where these three goals overlap, and it's where we can invest strategically to address all three of these really important objectives that will determine our success in fully transitioning to a zero carbon economy. This requires both push and pull levers. So traditionally, when people think about workforce development, we think of training and education. And that is really important, improving career awareness, reducing barriers, investing in broad occupational training and the advanced skills training and upskilling. But we recognize that the labor market also has to pull workers into these jobs. That training alone cannot close the gap. And on the pull side, we're looking at how do we stimulate, how do we use public sector investments to stimulate private sector investment, which is the investments themselves are where the jobs are created? How do we develop national training standards and industry recognized credentials so that there's a really clear market signal for workers entering into this space? How can we use labor standards and track compliance so that, again, the labor market is signaling to workers, hey, if you invest in your education and training for this work or occupation or industry, you'll see some return on that investment. Your skills will be valued in the labor market. And all of these things, of course, are important to attracting and retaining a skilled workforce. And so we're looking not just at the traditional push levers, the education and training levers, but also the demand side pull levers to make sure that the clean energy workforce, that clean energy is an opportunity that people want to move toward. All of this work is really informed by both White House guidance and several recent executive orders that encourage domestic content and really building out domestic supply chains, which in turn will create more manufacturing jobs. Other executive orders, 14025, to encourage worker organizing and collective bargaining and really center these investments around the needs of workers and their ability to advocate for themselves in the workplace. Executive Order 14008 is the whole of government approach to addressing the climate crisis. It's very centered around the goal of creating good paying union jobs. And then finally, the most recent executive order relates to the use of project labor agreements on large construction contracts. And there might be more executive orders. So you can see that the administration's priorities are really how do we build out this workforce and make these investments in a way that meets the needs of industry, but also meets the need of workers. So that is all I have. Robbie, I'll leave it to you about whether we're doing questions now or at the end.
Yeah, we should move to the next speaker and we will come back with Q&A, but please do send your questions using the Q&A feature and we will try to respond to them at the end. Over to you, Aaron.
Okay, thanks, Robbie. Hi, everyone. My name is Aaron Anaya. I'm a section manager at Orange and Rockland Utilities, and I'm responsible for doing distributed energy resource interconnection from application through to permission to operate. My background, I started with fossil fuel generation operations. I've worked in substation engineering, and now I'm doing distribution operations and distribution protection and interconnections. So today we want to talk about the 1547 commissioning credentialing program, but specifically I want to answer a couple questions for you with this presentation. So what is the utility interconnection commissioning process? I'll briefly go over that. I'll go over the 1547, what exactly it is. How is the standard changed? You know, it's sometimes easy to identify when there's a difference between two different things, the importance of what the changes are and what they indicate. So I'll point that out. And then what is the commissioning process and how would this benefit the utilities and the distributed energy resource interconnection at a wider scale throughout the country and world. So quick poll, how familiar are you with the IEEE 1547? I'll give you a second to check one of the four options: very familiar, moderately familiar, heard of it, but not familiar, or just never even heard of it. Okay. So looks like half have heard of this thing, the 1547. 17% never heard of it. Some are very familiar and some are moderately familiar. Good. So first of all, I will talk about just generally speaking, the kind of generic distributed energy resource interconnection process. Okay. So we start over on the left here with this arrow where an application's received by utility. It's considered to be complete, and then it moves into either a screen where, maybe it's a smaller interconnection, less impactful, goes down to approval. If it's more complex, maybe it requires a study, then maybe goes to approval. But the larger and impactful distributed energy resource interconnections may require an impact study where modeling and mitigation is required. And then ultimately, hopefully we move to an approval if it's not too expensive. At that point, the system is built, permitted, and then the inspection after the construction is complete is really the commissioning part of the process that we're here to discuss. And that's what this education and credentialing program is looking to address. This important part to get to the final goal of permission to operate and continuous operation of a distributed energy resource site. And let me just take a step back. For those unfamiliar, DER, you'll see that and hear that. Distributed energy resource, it's generators, PV, it could be combustion engines even. It doesn't have to be a renewable energy, but typically we are looking at inverter-based and renewable resources for the most part. It also includes energy storage, so batteries are included here. It's really anything connecting to the distribution system. So just going to touch on the typical utility commissioning process today. So there's a site documentation and take a step back. What is commissioning? First of all, tests and verifications of an installed DER site. It's going to confirm that it meets with the interconnection and interoperability requirements of either as designed or requirements of utility or of the standard. So the standard would be the 1547. So typical commissioning process is basically three high-level things that are done. There's a site document where the inverter settings or as-built drawings are reviewed, and that happens in the office before going to the field. There's an on-site inspection, which is looking at the technical requirements and National Electric Code, for instance, utility construction requirements, etc. And then there's the commissioning part where we're looking at the operational requirements of the site. Two common areas that are displayed would be a cease to energize, where the system is, a switch is opened and it's observed that the system comes offline and doesn't continue to energize the site or, beyond that open or on the DER side of the open, the systems should come off within 2 seconds, according to the standard. So, and then also once utility powers are restored, there's a certain time frame where the system is expected to reconnect, and that's observed, and that becomes the de facto commissioning process for the most part. So the IEEE standard is, as Ravi touched on, it's been codified in the Federal Energy Policy Act of 2005. And, it goes back to 2003 when the first standard was developed. It was recognized that, distribution systems were not designed for active generation. And there's a need for a document to standardize and to gain consensus for these types of interconnections. And some of the benefits of the standard provides uniform requirements for the performance, testing, and maintenance of these sites. And it also defines technical requirements for manufacturers, utilities, any company involved in DER interconnection, regulators as well. So I just want to also point out that the 1547 doesn't necessarily have to be followed unless it becomes part of, say, a state commission law requirement that may require utilities to follow the standard, or if utilities decide to adopt the standard themselves. But once that happens, as we're looking at this arrow at the bottom, there's going to have to be compliance with the DER. Customers and the inspection commissioning would have to be expanded upon. So that's really what we're talking about today. Now, as I said, there's the 2003 version of the standard was the first one, and 15 years later, it was revised to the 2018 version. So I just want to point out some changes. The original standard was 15 pages and 16 with the annex. It's expanded 8 times to be 94 pages for the base standard with 136 pages total if you include the annexes. That's a significant increase in content and requirements. The 2003 version did not really anticipate high penetration, required the DER pretty much to come offline for minimal disturbances. Fast forward to the 2018, and it provides provisions for bulk power system support, such as ride-through, for voltage, frequency ride-through, and active voltage response as well. The 2003 version had a 10 megawatt cap for the size where this standard was applicable to, and the 2018 it covers any size for connected distributed system resources. 2003 distributed resources, as it was referred to in that standard, were not supposed to actively regulate voltage at the point of common coupling, the PCC. Looking at the 2018, there are requirements, capabilities of DER to be able to provide reactive power support, such as volt var or volt watt, to support utility power at the distribution level. Open phase really wasn't addressed in the 2003, and in the new standard, there's specific requirements for open phase detection. And likewise, there's functional prioritization on the 2018 version where there's many various functions, as I mentioned, but there's a hierarchy of requirements. So the tripping requirements override the ride-through requirements, and the ride-through overrides volt watt requirements, and volt watt overrides volt var requirements. So there's a hierarchy of these requirements, and these are all things that have changed, and we would want utility engineers to know as they're commissioning these sites. I was fortunate to serve on the 1547.2, which is the application guide to the DOT standard. I was a subgroup lead for the power quality requirements. So I'm just highlighting here at a high level some of the requirements that have changed from the 2003 to the 2018 standard. The RVC, the rapid voltage change, was not really addressed in the 2003. And today it states the DR shall not cause a step or ramp change at the RMS at the PCC exceeding 3% of nominal and exceeding 3% second per second of averaged over the period of 1 second. And the importance of that is that the RVC, excessive RVC impacts on the end user range could be an issue with, light output or motor load torque transients at the PCC. The flicker is more prescriptive now, where the short-term flicker severity and the long-term flicker severity must be maintained below the levels shown here. The harmonic content was limited for the even harmonics to less than 25% of the odd harmonics. So that was a change. And then the overvoltage temporary and cumulative instantaneous voltage was limited, or limits were placed at 1.38% to address the need for effective grounding for specifying fundamental frequency over voltage at that level. And that's aimed to address ground fault over voltage, and the hope was that the cumulative instantaneous limit speeds up the overvoltage tripping of the DER to prevent load rejection over voltage when the PCC recloser perhaps opens up. So those are some 2003 to 2018 changes. Another change is the point of common coupling, or the PCC. As you see here, there is a one-line diagram with these different points. PCC, point of common coupling, which is where the area EPS and the local EPS are connected. So the 2003 standard stated that the standard has to comply at the PCC. And there's another point here, which is the point of connection, which is identified in the 2003 version, but not really something that the standard was required to be complied with. But it was just the point where the DER is connected to the area electric power system. So looking forward to the 2018 version, we see that the POC and the PCC have some different configurations here, and now there's what's called the reference point of applicability, and that's the location where the standard applies. And what it means is that there may be simplification and cost advantages of having the DER meet the standard requirements at the point of connection versus the point of common coupling. Typically the point of common coupling will be the reference point of applicability, but there is the possibility that the RPA will be at the POC. So some of the considerations are shown here in this flow chart: zero sequence continuity, the size of the DER, the amount of generation that's coming from the DER would determine, PCC or POC. So I think the highlight here is that that's something that a commissioning engineer or agent needs to be aware of when they go out to the site. So the typical commissioning process here, from my company, Orange and Rockland, we have been updating our commissioning requirements documents, but it's probably similar to many utilities. We have a pre-test, a checklist, which goes over the physical layout, and some of the standard UL certification, checking the inverter model, checking the disconnect switch, etc. And we go through tests, pretty standard test, which involves a cease to energize of the site, opening a switch. And in the 2003 standard, by ceasing to energize, that verified conformance with a number of different sections in the standard itself by doing that simple test. It confirmed area EPS faults, recloser coordination, voltage, frequency, and unintentional islanding. I think we'll see that is going to need to be expanded upon significantly for the new 2018 standard compliance. You know, we would check, like in today's commissioning test, we'd check under voltage, over voltage, or under frequency, over frequency, ramp, power factor, and you know, we've added an open phase test to comply with the 2018, but you know, there's a lot more, which I think you'll see here. The test requirements for the 2018 are covered in detail in section 11 in the test and verification requirements section. So the DER evaluation is kind of the desk study, looking at your documents that have been submitted from the developer. The commissioning engineer is looking at them, making sure that they're complete before they would go into the field typically. And once they have the required documents, that's when the verification and testing and the interoperability of the standards of the site are assessed. So I want to show that the standard itself has expanded to show a number of tables for each of the sections of the requirements. So here on the far, from looking at this somewhat of an eye chart from left to right, just showed an excerpt. It shows the requirements clause on the left, and then for the purpose of the commissioning, we're looking at this green, oval, which is, the DER evaluation, as I stated before, which is like the desk study, and then the commissioning tests. So there are, for each of the clauses, there's a column that says DER system or composite. So the DER system would be, say, the fully compliant at the PCC. The composite system would be possibly the POC consideration. But all I'm showing here is that each of the clauses have a category for what requirements need to be assessed during the commissioning and during the DER evaluation. So there's a lot of information to be known for the commissioning engineer. But this is a resource to help. But just looking at this could be pretty confusing. So I think some training is required, basically. So the DER evaluation, you have this column that says, whether that's a required test or there's, depends on the DER evaluation site, or whether it's non-applicable. But all these clauses have, this guidance for commissioning. So why do we need the program? Because DER interconnections are increasing, and maybe, some states are out there a little bit further with their goals than others, but it's pretty well known that, some states are moving forward with advanced and aspirational renewable energy and clean energy goals to have 100% renewable or 100% clean energy by some date in the future. That is rapid. It's approaching pretty quickly. And where we are today, I think that we need to prepare by not just allowing for these interconnections, but preparing the workforce to be ready to safely and in a qualitative way interconnect these resources. Another thing that is also increasing the need for more training would be possibly the FERC 2222 order, which is opening the door for distributed energy resources to participate in wholesale markets in the bulk power system. So just more reasons why distributed energy resource increased penetration is it's a recommendation to adopt the 1547 standard to prepare. So some of the benefits of the program, I'll just reiterate as I've touched upon throughout the presentation, but it's going to give utilities a training program for their commissioning engineers. It's going to provide a pool of candidates for qualified individuals, for the case of outsourcing to commission sites, or if a utility just has that as their standard policy, where other commissioning agents are commissioning the sites. It standardizes the commissioning process so that when you go from one state to the next, you can kind of expect a standardized, what to expect basically. The additional knowledge of personnel helps to promote the DER adoption process. And finally, authorities having jurisdiction mandating the 1547 have a resource to know what needs to be complied with. So with that, I will, the chat is open for any Q&A, and I'm going to hand it back off to Ravi, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Aaron. Very informative presentations from both Bethany and Aaron. I'm going to wrap things up here a little bit before we jump to Q&A. Back in 2019, IEEE convened 5 major U.S. utilities who had come forth to look at developing a education and credentialing program for 1547. That was our narrow view at this point, although now that we are nearing completion of the development of the education credentialing program, we definitely see a need to expand that to include other standards like 2800 and other areas that we may want to focus on. So I want to recognize our participating utilities, BG&E, ComEd, Dominion Energy, Duke Energy, and obviously Orange and Rockland. What are some of the key deliverables from this committee was we wanted to look at delivering commissioning resources. So not many utilities have experienced and knowledgeable staff like Aaron for Orange and Rockland. And how do these utilities manage the rise in DER interconnections? So we wanted to create some templates, commissioning checklists, on-site assessment processes, and make that available to the stakeholders. The second piece was to look at an educational program. We really see this as sort of a classroom style, maybe it's in a hybrid form education to train. So this is not just for incumbent coming into the clean energy workforce, not just students, undergraduate students, but also folks that are already in the workforce but have to be retrained to address some of these new technologies. And we are progressing very rapidly on that. We also saw a need to credential people. So it's not just that someone attends a course, but we want to ensure that these people are certified to do the work that they have been tasked to do. So those were 3 key things that the committee focused on. And just to reiterate, some of these things Aaron did touch on, but I do want to emphasize on a couple of things here. We truly need to alleviate the burden on utilities. As we see an increase in the number of DER interconnections, it is going to take a lot of effort to get these DERs online, functioning safely and efficiently. So we need to have trained people to do the commissioning. We also very early on in the research process, we saw that commissioning was done very differently, although all of them claimed to be adhering to the 1547 standard. So we did see many, many anomalies, and we really felt that this should be standardized. Another key piece that we looked at was periodic testing and commissioning. What's the frequency for that? How do these systems degrade over time? How do we monitor and capture that? So those are some of the items that this committee is also looking at. And obviously, we want to, encourage DER adoption and also be a complete resource to industry. So I want to point out a couple of things real quick. We obviously, IEEE wishes to scale the education and credentialing process. So we are really looking for educational institutes, which may include universities, training providers, who could be the content provider to a large mass of potential students or the workforce that may want to benefit from this training. So I encourage you to contact IEEE. We definitely wish to speak with you. Another key item is for utilities. This program is being developed as a resource for the utilities. It's there to alleviate the stress on yourselves, reduce costs, ensure that there's a broad range of trained people, not just within the US, but internationally, where we are seeing huge increase in DER interconnections happening. So we encourage utilities to reach out to us as well. We want to address any other concerns that utilities see and see if we can address that through the program. Engineering firms, you are a critical part of the ecosystem. You potentially could be going out and commissioning new systems, large, small, mixed asset. The training is meant to address all of those things. So you should definitely keep a watch on the website, and it's on the resource page to figure out how you can participate and benefit from the program. I've also included several links to publications that have come out recently over the last 2 years. So please do take a read. It would give you a lot more information than what has been presented here today. So with that, I'm going to turn to Q&A. I do have a question for Bethany. So let me go to that. So we talked generally about decarbonization. Decarbonization is just not US focused, it's international. So the question for Bethany is, how can we leverage the US expertise and lesson learned to support knowledge transfer for less experienced countries and other global system operators?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, part of what we're doing at DOE is just engaging in the dialogue with other countries. In fact, we just had a call a couple of weeks ago with probably 10 or 12 different countries sharing information and best practices on how to assess the potential for clean energy jobs, what are the training pathways, what are the occupations in demand, and just sharing information and resources. And I think everyone participating in that found it really useful. And there's other international organizations that engage particularly on just transition issues and with labor organizations that are looking at best practices regarding just transition or transitioning energy workers to new clean energy work, whether that requires reskilling or it's just a shift in work within the same occupation. So I think there can be quite a lot of that the U.S. can do to provide, what we've learned in this space, but also quite a lot that the U.S. can learn, because there's really interesting efforts in, everywhere from Vietnam to South Africa to Europe to other parts of Asia. I mean, there's people working on these issues all over the world, and I think it's not a one-directional transfer of our best practices. It's really how can we all learn from each other.
Thanks for that. So it's kind of a follow-up to that, Bethany. You did mention during your presentation about the extensive amount of investment that's going into the different areas like hydrogen and advanced nuclear and offshore wind. Does the DOE plan to provide a more granular look at what type of workforce is going to be required? We have union jobs, we have skilled labor. Is there a plan to show us a granular view of what kind of crafts and job types are anticipated in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think that the USEER report is a retrospective analysis, but what we've learned from retrospective analyses is that it's not so much that we're going to see entirely new, quote, green job occupations grow up from scratch. It's really the transition to a low carbon grid and energy system is really just a shift in the work that people do, and some opportunities for upskilling. So, for example, this is a different industry, but in the automotive industry, we have a skilled workforce to build internal combustion engine vehicles. What is going to be required going forward as we electrify transportation is going to be a shift in what kinds of inputs go into those vehicles, from the drivetrains for ICE vehicles to, where most of the value in an electric vehicle is in the battery. So that's a shift in work. That's a shift in the type of manufacturing work that takes place. But hopefully the new opportunities can be, for battery manufacturing, can be geographically similar and occupationally similar to jobs that we already have today. So we're really interested in the skills mapping, where we can really avoid whole cloth transition of workers to entirely new occupations, and recognizing that maybe you work on an offshore oil rig today, but there's a lot of overlap in the skills that are going to be required for offshore wind tomorrow. And so how do we match those skills and match those occupations so that we're not allowing whole categories of workers to just lose their jobs, and creating whole new categories of jobs for different workers, but that there's some stronger alignment there.
Great, thank you for that. There's a lot of questions coming in, great questions. There's some very generic questions about, what is anti-islanding, and I appreciate those questions. There are lots of resources available. I will try to post them on the resource page. So there are many webinars that IEEE has produced that addresses a lot of those questions as well. This is a sticky topic. IEEE 1547 and cybersecurity requirements. Aaron, do you want to touch on that? Are there any requirements for cybersecurity?
Ravi, I'll be honest, the cybersecurity part isn't my expertise. I know it does touch on cybersecurity, but I don't think it goes deep into cybersecurity details. I think there are other documents or resources for that.
Here's a very general question. Are we differentiating clean energy versus renewable energy, or are they one and the same?
Yeah, the clean energy is, renewable energy comes from naturally replenishing resources, such as solar or wind, and clean energy includes nuclear, zero carbon energy. So clean energy is a wider category.
Okay. Just to follow on to that, you talked about the commissioning process. Are you differentiating a residential type project versus a more commercialized, large utility grade project, and how that commissioning might differ?
I think it depends on the utility where the interconnection happens. Some utilities may require the residential to go through the same commissioning process. It may be dependent upon size, or also familiarity with if a utility accepts UL 1741, which is the UL confirmation of the standard, right? Compliance with the standard of a particular piece of equipment or device, if they accept that as an acceptable inverter, say, and it's interconnected at residential voltage that may be not requiring of a full commissioning test, but just self-commissioning is sometimes accepted.
Okay. Thank you, Aaron. So we are out of time, but I would like the discussion to continue. So please do keep in touch. Do feel free to send any emails to the connect_der@ieee.org email address. I want to thank our speakers, Bethany and Aaron, for spending the time today, as well as the backstage team that helped to produce this webinar. And most importantly, I want to thank the audience for taking time out of your day to attend this webinar. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you at a future webinar.
Thank you.